Thank you for that paper. Our final paper for today is by Nina Kushner. Nina received her PhD in 2005 from Columbia University. She is now associate professor at Clark University and also author of the recent much discussed book, Erotic Exchanges, Elite Prostitution in 18th Century Paris, which came out with Cornell University Press in 2014, and as you've heard, is the co-editor of the collection Woman and Work in 18th Century France, with Daryl Hafter, author as well of many articles and book chapters. Her talk today is entitled Female Violence, Cuckoldry, and Constructions of Masculinity in 18th Century Paris.
On the evening of August 18th, 1787, the much-aggrieved Antoine Baumé, the famous chemist, a maître de pharmacie, and a member of the Académie des Sciences, went to the house of Paris Police Commissioner Sirabeau to lodge a complaint against his wife, Marie-Louise Baumé, with the ultimate aim of having her incarcerated. According to Baumé and to witnesses the commissioner later interviewed, his wife was violent. She was a thief and an adulterer. It was not Baumé's marital troubles, however, that I find interesting. Rather, it's how Baumé talks about them. What does he privilege in his story? What is ancillary? And what are the stakes in his particular strategy to lock up his wife? Ultimately, the reasons as to why Baumé made the decisions he did are not recoverable, but in contextualizing his options, we have a lens through which to view contemporary ideas about female violence, masculinity, and adultery. Baumé claimed in this testimony, the previous morning, Marie-Louise had entered his room with, quote, furor in her eyes and gestures, and she hit him in the jaw. As she raised her hand to strike him again, and I should say that she hit him in her jaw with the left hand and then raised the right to strike him, so she was really... Baumé pushed his wife to, quote, get her away from him, and in the process infuriated her further still. She then seized a porcelain water pitcher and broke it over his bare head, and in Baumé's telling seriously injured him. 3 domestics came running when they heard the noise, but Madame Baumé was so moved by her excess of fury, and this phrase comes up a lot, that neither an audience nor her own pain, she had cut her hand badly, interrupted her momentum as she held a knife in that bloodied hand and threatened her husband with terrible things. He had locked himself in his cabinet, and his refusal to respond to her imprecations, quote, irritated her further still. She then threatened to kill him, to have him killed, and to set the house on fire. What provoked this violent assault? Baumé says nothing, suggesting that indeed it was nothing. Consequently, he constructs his wife less as an angry, violent woman, so much as one driven completely by the excesses of her fury. She's not quite the senseless animal described by Arnouf Domont in his discussion of the medical condition fureur in the Encyclopédie, but as everything exacerbated her rage, she was close. She was completely without reason. Baumé, it would seem, had a right to be afraid. After a long description of the incident, Baumé, however, does get a bit of context. For the past 9 weeks, he says, Marie-Louise had been seeking fights, the reason being that he had banned from their home and his wife's company a frequent visitor, an overnight guest, a man named Boissieu, whom Baumé suspected his wife of having an affair, with whom Baumé suspected his wife. From this moment, the chemists claim, Marie left the house each morning early and did not return until evening, and each day pilfered items from the house. Some silverware, his shirts, other linens, items totaling, he estimated, 2,000 livres. But, he concludes, it was his need for protection that brought him to the police. Perhaps this is not entirely true, as 36 hours later, Baumé returned to Sirabeau's hotel with new information. The previous morning, Madame Baumé had left the house and had not come back, and she had taken her clothes and jewels, bringing the value of the missing goods up to 6,000 livres. Now, given all the available options, why would Baumé tell the story this way? Why would he focus on his wife's violence and his fear of her, and to a lesser degree her theft, while pretty much downplaying her adultery? In doing so, he seemingly impugned his own masculinity. He appeared before the police, a battered old man, he had about 25 years on his wife, and told a story in which he could not subdue his spouse and only escaped further harm because of the servants. In the more traditional constructs of marriage and gender, he positions himself as a husbandly failure. He had no idea where his wife was all day, every day. He was unaware of what was happening in his own home, and he had just no control, not physical, economic, nor sexual, over his wife and hence his household. The trope of woman on top was particularly problematic in early modern France. It was a fodder of both comedy and social nightmare, so ridiculous and terrifying that, as Natalie Zeman-Davis tells us, it was dealt with not only legally but ritually, through temporary inversion of gender order at carnivals and through rough music. Husbands like Baumé, dominated by their wives in this earlier period, could expect to be the subject of a charivari, a way for a community to censure and right disordered gender relations. But while the power of husbands over wives and children expanded in the early modern period, the social authority to use this power actually declined. Families and communities continued to police gender disorder just differently, and perhaps not so intensely. Expectations in the later 18th century were for a kinder, gentler model of the patria potestas, and certainly not one emasculated, cowering in the corner from blows from his wife. The older husband was a stock comic figure. The older, beaten husband was just a pathetic one. What makes Baumé's story even more interesting is that there are other commonly used and effective strategies for incarcerating problematic and even violent spouses. And I realize I just say that like, yeah, it's kind of horrifying. We see in complaints to commissioners, as well in placettes for lettres de cachet, the ways in which aggrieved husbands and other family members wove stories together of sexual misconduct, theft, and violence into a single plot line, in which the wife's behavior was so problematic and so resistant to correction that it had or surely would bring either economic ruin or dishonor to the family. This strategy was certainly available to Baumé, as we can see through witness testimonies. Beyond supporting Baumé's depiction of his wife as being moved by an excess of furor, all four domestics testified to her relationship with Boissieu. The days and weeks the couple spent alone at his place or hers. The gardeners reported seeing Boissieu emerge from Madame Baumé's room more than once at 7 a.m. in a dressing gown. It's like, just think it through. One gardener saw the couple fooling around, Boissieu's culottes undone. Even Madame Baumé thought her sexual behavior was an issue. A few hours before her husband visited Commissioner Sirabeau, Marie-Louise went to see a different commissioner, Michel Pierre Goyot, to lodge a sort of defensive complaint against her husband. Baumé, she claimed, had, this is her words, outrageously accused her of adultery, both publicly and in writing. And according to this complaint, Marie-Louise thought her husband had already gone to see Sirabeau before the assault to start the processes necessary to have her incarcerated for adultery. And there's two ways to do this. One's a trial, and the other's a lettre de cachet, and they both end up with a wife in a convent, so just different choices. The testimony of Baumé's friends suggests that he was aware of his wife's adultery. During the 9 weeks of discord before the incident, Baumé engaged at least two friends to try to reconcile Madame Baumé and bring her back to her duties. Both reported Madame Baumé vehemently resisted all such entreaties. As for the theft, the domestic's testimony was even more damning than that of Baumé. Beyond confirming the smaller daily thefts, the cook claimed months before Madame Baumé had directed her to bring porcelain objects to Boissieu at his chateau, and further claimed that Madame Baumé stocked Boissieu's table with vegetables from her husband's garden and wine from his cellar. Lastly, there's the issue of the couple's 4-year-old child. In the more traditional strategy, neglect of children is the last straw. One domestic accused Madame Baumé of ignoring her daughter entirely because she was spending her days out, probably with Boissieu. The sum of the witness testimonies created a different picture than did Baumé. Baumé was not a crazy, wild harridan, nor, for that matter, was Sir Baumé a hapless victim. In witness testimonies, he fought back and actually injured his wife, which is why her hand was bleeding. He put her through a window. Madame Baumé was instead an unrepentant adulterer, using her and her husband's property to support and enhance her lover's household. So we return to the original question. For Baumé, why focus on his wife's alleged violence and his own physical victimhood, when Marie-Louise's adultery and theft would likely have resulted in her incarceration? The question assumes the operation of a fairly traditional hierarchy of masculine shame, that being beaten by one's wife is more problematic than having her steal or cheat. We need to revisit this assumption to consider that there were multiple models of masculinity in the 18th century, as well as multiple sexual cultures. As a philosophe, Baumé belonged to a specific community, one which had a high tolerance for adultery. Furthermore, it was a community in which masculinity was defined in ways that tended to downplay the physical and reconsider that sort of archetypal marital dominance. While there's a rich scholarship on the topic, I found the short essay on 18th century French masculinity by literary scholar Anne Villa to be the most useful. Villa identifies models of 18th century masculinity, including that of the natural man, the family man, and the philosophe. Arguing that these models were informed by some of the century's great movements, Villa makes the case for the ways in which sensitivity, intellectual greatness, and fatherhood all came to be critical components of masculinity. She further argues that for such authors as Voltaire and Diderot, I'm going to quote, the philosophe was indeed an honnête homme for the new generation. He was a virtuous, tolerant, compassionate man who eschews metaphysical speculation in favor of useful knowledge. Antoine Baumé was, by this definition, an honnête homme. As a philosophe, he was incredibly successful, as his éloge testifies. As a scientist whose work was in pharmacy and chemistry, he certainly generated useful knowledge. As for his character, he was sensitive, and the witnesses say he teared up in thinking about the great betrayal of his wife and believed that his wife wanted him to die from sadness, so all that kind of hyperbolic emotional language. He embodied the post-La Nouvelle Héloïse model of husbandliness. The witnesses painted Sir Baumé as a model husband who gave his wife everything she desired, until the moment Baumé cut his wife off from Boissieu, their mutual friend. But even Baumé's means of doing so continued to follow the late 18th century script of the good, sensitive husband. Baumé took this gentle corrective step, attempting to bring his wife back to her duties, rather than taking more definitive legal action or engaging in violence. As the patient elder Volmar, he was willing to put up with his wife's anger, even her thefts, for more than 2 months. Rousseau did include in his masculine ideal an intense physical prowess and toughness, but Rousseau himself spent a great deal of time both complaining about physical ailments and being immobilized by them, and showing no shame in either. So Baumé measured up to most of these new masculine standards, and if he fell short of being the Spartan warrior Rousseau imagined, he was in good company. Antoine Baumé was also enmeshed in a community in which adultery was endemic, if not compulsive. Many philosophes did not marry on principle. Baumé himself married only at the age of 53. But these men did have affairs with single and especially married women. And once married, many continued to have affairs and wrote about them and their adultery in such neutral tones as if to suggest that adultery had no meaning as such. Married female philosophers also had long-term adulterous affairs. Personally, adultery may have been a disaster for particular individuals or couples. Within the confines of the community, however, there was broad acceptance, one reflecting in a growing unease with the harsh punishments for adulterous wives. In this socio-cultural universe, perhaps adultery might not have been seen as sufficiently serious to visit the police, and certainly not problematic enough to warrant arrest, but violence was. Baumé, however, was not just of this community. He clearly had friends, and some of them testified to Mirabeau, who were noble de robe or on their way, the kind of people to whom Robert Nye points as embodying a specific kind of bourgeois notion of family honor that vigorously condemned adultery. Perhaps Mirabeau was one of these, because when he wrote the order to have Madame Baumé appear before him, it was for scandalous conduct, meaning problematic sexual conduct, and threatening her husband. So that was the order. How does the story end? The couple never reconciled. Madame Baumé was incarcerated in a convent, and I'm not sure yet if that was the result of a trial or a lettre cachée, because the documents are in the Petit Châtelet, which suggests there's a trial, but I haven't quite figured this out yet. She was let out 5 years later, in August of 1792. Baumé lived through the worst violence of the revolution, only to die financially ruined in 1804.